Hey everyone, today's story is about a beginner necromancer who tries to summon a simple undead. But instead, she accidentally revives the Demon King. And the craziest part is nothing like she expected. So with that said, let's begin the story. Alice Red Ashley, a novice necromancer, stood among majestic trees and ancient stone structures, determined to perform her first serious magical ritual. Her wavy hair flew upward as if caught by an invisible wind, and her eyes burned with fierce enthusiasm. The girl, dressed in a gown with a wide, elegant collar and neat buttons, opened her mouth wide, summoning a spirit to become her faithful servant and commanding it to rise from the very realm of the dead. Alice's palms were turned forward, her fingers spread wide in tension, as if she were striving to grasp the elusive essence of the other world, while magical energy swirled and pulsed around her, ready to bring the spell to life. But in the next instant, the solemn mood vanished. Deep confusion was reflected on Alice's beautiful face. Her eyes widened in bewilderment, her eyebrows shot upward, and her features twisted with bewilderment. The girl realized with alarm that the magical power, the mana, was vanishing without a trace. Beneath the heroine's feet lay an exquisite floor, adorned with intricate ornamentation featuring graceful scrolls and circular decorative elements, which now seemed a silent witness to her failure. Alice recoiled sharply, losing her footing from the sudden shock. Her eyes widened in horror, and her body bent forward in an attempt to maintain her balance as she finally made out the figure before her through the thick clouds of fog. Instead of the expected undead, a living man appeared before her, sitting calmly on a stone tombstone. The girl collapsed to the ground, unable to believe what was happening. Her mind frantically searched for an explanation for what she had seen. She wondered why necromancy had summoned a human instead of a zombie or a skeleton, and alarming thoughts flashed through her mind. Was this a catastrophic failure of the ritual or an incredible success? The stranger looked down at her with grim composure. His gaze was intense, and his red eyes glowed in the dim light, contrasting with his dark hair and pale skin. A self-assured smirk, full of hidden menace, was frozen on the man's face. He coldly remarked that her reaction was too harsh for a first meeting. The man warned her of grave danger, hinting that any attempt to cast a spell on him could instantly cost her life. Sitting on the ground amid the remnants of the magical mist, Alice realized with astonishment a startling fact. The entity she had summoned possessed the gift of speech. She had never heard of an undead being able to speak, and this discovery left her frozen in bewilderment. Soon, the shock gave way to wild joy. The girl's eyes sparkled, and her face reflected the anticipation of a grand success. She began to hope that this might mean success on her very first attempt, which was considered a stunning achievement for a novice necromancer, successfully resurrecting a human instead of a soulless creature. Pulling herself together, Alice stood up and turned to the man, who was still sitting on the stone tombstone. A glimmer of hope arose in her mind that Ashley's family would finally recognize her talents and merits. The girl felt embarrassed by her earlier behavior and apologized to the stranger, explaining that she had lost her composure for a moment due to a rush of emotions. Then a broad, sincere smile lit up her face, and a slight blush of excitement appeared on her cheeks. Alice confidently placed her hand on her chest and introduced herself with pride. She gave her full name, Alice Red Ashley, and declared her status as a necromancer, as if wishing to cement her success and establish contact with the resurrected being. With incredible confidence, Alice declared that from this day forward, the man belonged to her as a familiar. At that very moment, her hand shot forward, and her index finger pointed decisively at him, unambiguously designating this very man as her future familiar, while she asserted that she herself was assuming the role of his mistress, thereby cementing their new hierarchy. The man listened to this loud declaration with stoic calm. His gaze remained heavy and inscrutable. Dark strands of hair fell across his forehead, contrasting with the pallor of his skin, and his red eyes glowed with a cold fire. He made no attempt to object or withdraw, simply accepting her words as fact, while the girl insisted on her right to dictate his fate against the backdrop of the cemetery's gloomy shadows. The man laughed loudly, throwing his head back. His laughter seemed unrestrained and laced with sarcasm. He questioned the girl's words, mockingly asking if she truly considered herself his mistress. Alice stood nearby, feeling insulted by such a dismissive attitude toward her status. The girl flared with anger, her face contorted with indignation. She exclaimed that there was nothing funny about her words, for it was she who had resurrected him from the dead. Alice declared that she had irrefutable proof of her power over him. To back up her words, she cast a spell. A chain woven from energy materialized around the man's neck and jerked sharply downward. The man lost his balance. His body leaned forward under the spell's irresistible force. Genuine surprise flashed across his face when he heard the command to kneel, and he fell to his knees. Alice smiled and said that this was precisely what proved their master-servant relationship, and asked him to acknowledge it. The man took a link of the chain and replied that he understood this was the effect of binding. Alice confirmed this and asked him not to resist. The man calmly grabbed the magical chain around his neck with his hand and pulled on it lightly, as if testing its strength. His gaze remained cold and appraising, and his fingers clenched the links tightly. Alice's reaction was immediate. Her face contorted into a grimace of horror, her eyes widened to their limits, and a bead of cold sweat trickled down her temple. The girl realized the situation was spiraling out of control, and her recent confidence had given way to panic-stricken fear of the familiar's power. Meanwhile, the man looked at her with a sinister, triumphant smirk. His red eyes glowed with an ominous light, emphasizing his dominant position. He declared that if that was indeed the case, he would simply tear these shackles apart, defying the very essence of the necromantic spell. Alice froze in shock, her hand covering her mouth, cold sweat streaming down her face. She couldn't believe what was happening, realizing that the man had indeed broken the binding spell, as if it were a worthless spiderweb. Chaos reigned in her mind. She refused to accept the idea that her magic had proved powerless against the familiar's will. Despite her shock, the girl tried to regain her composure. The man stood calmly, his head turned slightly, as if nothing had happened. Alice peered over his shoulder, her face contorted with anger and indignation. She demanded an explanation. Who had allowed him to stand up? And she ordered him to sit back down immediately, trying to bring the situation back under control. However, her commands hung in the air. Alice's face expressed utter bewilderment. Her eyes widened, and her mouth fell open in a silent question. She didn't understand why her will no longer had any effect on the resurrected man. Deciding to test the connection once and for all, the girl began firing off commands one after another. She demanded he raise his hands, make a sound to check his throat, and even tried to make him clap his hands in agreement. The man stood motionless, arms crossed over his chest, and his gaze averted, completely ignoring her attempts to command him. Finally, the man slowly turned his head toward her, a smug smile playing on his face. He calmly informed her that the spell's effect had worn off. Alice froze in a posture of utter helplessness, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze expressing resignation to her fate. The man confirmed that she had finally understood the situation and declared that he no longer intended to serve her. Alice sat on the ground, completely crushed by what had happened. She bitterly wondered how this could have happened at all, and she realized her inability to control even a single dead person. The man stood nearby, his arms crossed over his chest, silently observing her reaction. The girl's face expressed deep disappointment in herself. With a forced smile and a bead of sweat on her temple, she admitted that she was truly useless. The man remained silent, watching her intently with his heavy gaze. Soon he broke the silence, asking the girl not to misunderstand the situation. He explained that the binding effect she had used was actually quite powerful. Referring to the tomb in the background, he added that under normal circumstances, breaking such a spell would be practically impossible. Against the backdrop of the dark, starry expanse, the man looked mysterious and imposing, radiating an aura of hidden power. He leaned forward slightly, and a self-assured, meaningful smirk played on his lips, while his eyes narrowed, studying the girl's reaction. He decided to lift the veil of mystery slightly and told Alice that he was not quite ordinary. The girl stared at him with eyes wide with surprise, frozen in anticipation and realizing that her familiar concealed something far more significant than she could have imagined. The man stood with his arms crossed over his chest, watching Alice with an impassive expression as she sat on the ground, still bewildered. He noticed that what had happened clearly did not match the outcome she had expected. Alice was completely bewildered. Her eyes widened, and her face reflected confusion. She frantically tried to make sense of his words, wondering if this was all just a cruel joke on the part of the undead, and she could only stammer helplessly, unable to find the right words. Suddenly, the man's expression changed drastically. His lips stretched into a wide, predatory, and frightening grin, baring his teeth, and his eyes narrowed, flashing with an ominous gleam. A dark aura seemed to thicken around him. He declared that since the magical bond had been broken, the situation was no longer boring for him. The man suggested they switch roles, hinting that now he would be the one giving orders and telling her what to do, turning the situation upside down. Alice's eyes widened in sudden horror as the full gravity of the situation dawned on her. She realized that the situation was developing extremely unfavorably. The man stood before her, hands on his hips, radiating such confidence and strength that the girl involuntarily cringed in fear. She bitterly realized that he had neutralized her magic with frightening ease, as if a powerful spell were nothing more than a trivial matter to him. The girl's gaze drifted downward, and she thought with despair that the resurrection ritual had consumed absolutely all of her mana. She understood that in hand-to-hand combat, she had absolutely nothing to oppose this powerful opponent. Sitting on the ground, Alice watched the man's figure with growing anxiety. She reminded herself that she was the one who had brought him back to life, which meant she was responsible for what was happening. The girl was determined that she could not let him do whatever he pleased. She had to buy time at any cost to come up with at least some kind of plan of action. With a tense expression and a bead of sweat on her temple, she let out a loud, deliberately strained cry, trying to hide her confusion and helplessness. Alice stood up straight, her posture radiating defiance and the last remnants of pride. Her eyes burned with determination, and her mouth opened in a loud, emotional cry. With bitter irony, the girl noted that she barely had a shred of dignity left after everything that had happened. Her hair and the hem of her dress billowed around her, emphasizing her resolve to accept this new reality. With defiance in her voice, she asked if he wished to see her as a servant. And then, as if challenging him, she offered to take his orders, accepting the rules of this strange game. The man looked at her, and a barely perceptible smile played across his face, full of satisfaction and interest. His gaze slid over the girl's resolute figure, and he seemed intrigued by this turn of events. The man suddenly replaced his anger with kindness. A broad, carefree smile lit up his face, his eyes closed in pleasure, and he enthusiastically announced that he had made up his mind. He agreed to be her familiar for a while. His mood seemed to have improved instantly, and he radiated confidence and ease. Alice's reaction was immediate. The girl froze in complete bewilderment, her eyes wide with shock, her mouth slightly agape. She was completely thrown off balance by such a sudden turn of events and his abrupt agreement, not understanding what was happening. Soon, deep distrust was written all over Alice's face. She narrowed her eyes and looked at the man with a piercing, suspicious gaze, trying to figure out his true intentions. Noticing her reaction, the man tried to brush aside her doubts, claiming he was just joking, and asked her not to make such a strange face, trying to steer the conversation back to light-hearted small talk. Alice took a few steps away from the tombstone and asked the man why he was in such a state. Leaning casually against the stone sarcophagus, he replied that he had only recently awakened and needed to figure out what was happening in the world. Then he asked if she belonged to any noble family. The man noted that speaking with her could prove extremely useful to him, as he had already realized this upon hearing her name. Alice turned to face him, listening intently to his words. With a sly smile on his face, the man added that she should listen to his reasoning. He stated that having such a powerful familiar as himself would undoubtedly be to her advantage. However, Alice did not look convinced at all. A skeptical expression crossed her face. She frowned slightly and let out a disapproving sound, clearly doubting the sincerity or benefits of the deal they were offering. Alice, whose face lit up with a broad, sincere smile, readily agreed to the proposed terms. She happily confirmed that their collaboration would be based on mutual benefit, her eyes sparkling with hope and her posture becoming more open and relaxed. The man, maintaining a confident, slightly sly smirk on his face, finally introduced himself. He said his name was Gran. Looking at the girl with his piercing gaze, he declared that he would be happy to work with her, addressing her as his master, thereby formally agreeing to the role of her familiar and cementing their new, albeit strange, alliance. The next day, a majestic structure with a dome and a fluttering flag rose against the backdrop of a clear sky, marking the beginning of a new day. Alice and Gran were heading to the academy. The girl walked beside the man, her face expressing extreme irritation and bewilderment. She was indignant that he didn't have to go to the academy with her at all. Gran, on the other hand, looked completely relaxed and carefree. He walked with his hands behind his head and remarked with a carefree smile that following his master was his direct duty. Alice continued on her way, making no secret of her displeasure with the situation. Gran followed her, mockingly confirming that he would carry out any order, and addressed her as his mistress, which only intensified the girl's irritation, making her feel uncomfortable. Alice was certain he was following her to find out something, and if Gran wasn't careful, he would attract too much attention. Gran gazed admiringly at the majestic academy building. A carefree smile lit up his face, and his eyes betrayed genuine interest. He expressed his admiration for the school's beauty without hesitation. Alice agreed with him, though her expression remained serious and preoccupied. Before them stood the Furman National Academy, a majestic structure with a dome and a flag, now over 200 years old. This educational institution was a unique phenomenon. It accepted students from both noble and common families, which was a great rarity. educational system included elementary school for children aged 6 to 12, middle school for those aged 13 to 15, and high school for those aged 16 to 18. Alice was currently in her second year of high school. The academy's flag, bearing its coat of arms, flew proudly in the wind, symbolizing the institution's principles. Although most of the funding came from donations by noble families, Firma, as a state, valued talent above social status, giving every capable student a chance regardless of their background. Alice and Gran walked along the paved path toward the majestic academy building. Gran remarked with genuine interest that the school seemed surprisingly progressive. Alice agreed that this was certainly a positive aspect, but when the man suggested there might be some kind of catch, she replied evasively that he would soon find out for himself. As soon as they were inside, in the long corridor with high arched ceilings, a quiet murmur rose around them. Students turned to look, whispered to one another, and watched the couple with intense stares. Some looked on with curiosity, others with clear disapproval, creating an atmosphere of tense attention around them. Alice walked beside him, a forced smile frozen on her face, while a bead of sweat on her temple betrayed her inner tension and irritation. Gran, on the other hand, looked completely relaxed and was smiling. He easily noticed that those around them were literally staring him down. Alice thought with annoyance that everything was going exactly as she had expected, and she reproached her companion, saying that it was precisely his appearance that was drawing all this unhealthy attention to them. Alice quickened her pace, trying to ignore the sidelong glances of those around them, and sharply told Gran to just keep walking, paying no attention to the commotion. The man froze for a moment, his expression turning serious and pensive. He wanted to say something, turned to the girl, but immediately stopped himself. Alice turned back with a question, but Gran just waved her off, suggesting she forget what he'd said. However, his perceptive gaze swept over the crowd of students. He noticed a group of students with light hair who were looking at them with obvious hostility. Gran realized that the hostility in their eyes wasn't directed at him. His face remained impassive, but his eyes narrowed as he analyzed the situation. Alice, meanwhile, continued on her way, her thoughts occupied by the very same thing. He understood that she was the object of this hatred. An image of Alice during her summoning attempt flashed through Gran's mind. He recalled how she had clutched her chest, realizing she was clearly not the type to shy away from risk. A vivid image of Alice surfaced in his memory, performing the magical ritual with incredible enthusiasm. Gran was amazed that, by a necromancer's standards, Alice's mana level was simply off the charts. Gran walked beside her, watching his companion with interest. He mused that perhaps it was precisely this trait of hers that made her so disliked in the eyes of those around her, even though she herself didn't even realize it. Alice, noticing his intense gaze, asked with irritation and confusion, "What's the matter? And why have you been staring at me this whole time?" Gran noted to himself with a slight smile that she was quite fun to be around. The man looked at her with a playful squint, clearly enjoying her reaction and embarrassment. Alice, however, looked at him with obvious disapproval and a touch of annoyance at his behavior. Gran, continuing to tease her, addressed her as if she were the hostess. Gran leaned closer to Alice, and a sly, encouraging smile played across his face. He asked if she wouldn't like to show off a little, and let everyone know that she was protected by such a powerful familiar. Alice froze in complete shock. Her eyes widened, her mouth fell open, and her face flushed deep with embarrassment and bewilderment at such audacity. Coming to her senses, the girl resolutely crossed her arms over her chest and turned away, expressing extreme irritation. She snapped at him to stop talking nonsense and defiantly retorted, asking who was actually protecting whom in their situation. Gran calmly followed her, keeping his hands on his hips and maintaining his composure. At that moment, someone called out to them. Suddenly, a figure appeared before Alice and Gran, his legs in light-colored pants blocking their path. The uninvited guest's voice rang out with clear contempt and rudeness. He declared that, apparently, it hadn't yet sunk in that she shouldn't be showing up on school grounds. Alice stood nearby, her arms firmly crossed over her chest, her face expressing irritation and discomfort at the insult she had heard. Gran, however, stood confidently, hands on his hips, and looked at his interlocutor with imperturbable calm. Alice's face showed extreme awkwardness and tension. A bead of sweat appeared on her temple, and her gaze was slightly averted, betraying her anxiety. She exhaled quietly, unable to hide her discomfort with the situation. Gran stood shoulder to shoulder with her, his face remaining impassively serious as he looked straight ahead, ignoring the provocation. Before Alice and Gran stood an arrogant young man with luxurious long blonde hair that fell in lush waves to his shoulders, framing his face. His appearance radiated aristocracy and confidence in his own superiority. A haughty, slightly mocking smile was frozen on his face, and his eyes looked at them with obvious contempt and condescension. The young man was dressed in a luxurious uniform that emphasized his high status. Behind him, the silhouettes of his entourage, which followed him everywhere, were visible. Samir Ivo Andri, the eldest son and heir of the great house of Andri, stood in the arched corridor of the academy and, with a venomous smirk, addressed Alice, calling her a failure and asking if she had really dragged herself back to the academy again without having learned a thing. Alice recognized her tormentor, and the name Samir slipped from her lips with a hint of bitter recognition. Gran, watching the scene from the sidelines, quietly remarked that the arrogant young man's behavior matched his appearance surprisingly well. Samir continued his verbal attack, calling Alice the only stain on the Ashley family's reputation and a disgrace to her lineage. With a scornful smirk, he asked if she really dared to show up at the academy looking so unperturbed, as if nothing had happened. Alice's face contorted into a grimace of deep revulsion. She sharply demanded that he stop calling her by name, declaring that the sound of her name on his lips literally made her sick. A tense atmosphere hung between them, heightening the overall tension of their sudden exchange. Samir stood with his arms crossed over his chest, looking smug and haughty, while Alice met his gaze with open hostility and a determination not to back down. Samir stood surrounded by his entourage, two young men who followed him everywhere. To one side of him stood a guy with light, tousled hair, dressed in a vest and tie. To the other, a young man wearing glasses. All three radiated arrogance and contempt, their faces twisted into mocking smirks. Samir, maintaining his haughty posture, turned to Alice, calling her a loser and declaring that she had only one option left, to try her hardest in the class for outsiders. He also warned her not to get in their way. Alice stood nearby, her face expressing deep disgust and helpless anger. She exhaled with difficulty, unable to hide her indignation at such treatment. Gran watched the scene from the sidelines, his arms crossed over his chest. His face remained impassively serious, but his eyes betrayed a cold assessment of what was happening. He silently took in the noble young man's arrogance and cruelty. Samir finally turned his attention to Gran, standing next to Alice. His gaze became more attentive and appraising. He wondered if this stranger was somehow connected to the academy. He was clearly surprised by the presence of a man who dared to accompany the disgraced representative of the Ashley family. Gran, standing with his arms crossed over his chest and a slight smirk on his face, calmly introduced himself. He stated that he was Alice's familiar. Samir froze in utter shock, his face contorted with extreme astonishment. His eyes widened, his pupils narrowed, and his mouth fell open in surprise. He couldn't believe what he'd heard and asked again, "Is there really a familiar standing before me?" Suddenly, the arrogant young man burst out laughing. His body shook with mirth, his long blonde hair flew to the sides, and his hands shot upward in a dramatic gesture. Samir's eyes sparkled with genuine amusement, and a broad, mocking smile played across his face. With obvious pleasure and amusement, he exclaimed that one would have to be completely mad to turn a living person into a familiar. His entourage stood nearby, watching the scene, while Gran remained imperturbably calm, raising an eyebrow only slightly at such a stormy reaction. Alice stood next to her familiar, her face expressing a mixture of embarrassment and irritation at what was happening. Alice's expression turned cold and resolute, her gaze seeming to darken with hidden emotions. She abruptly cut off the conversation, declaring that it had absolutely nothing to do with him. Turning decisively away from the arrogant young man, the girl headed down the academy corridor. As she walked, she called out to Gran, ordering him to follow her. Gran stood at a distance, maintaining his impassive posture with his arms crossed over his chest, and calmly watched as his mistress walked away from the conflict. Samir and his henchmen remained standing in place, watching their receding figures with their eyes. Meanwhile, Alice's footsteps sounded confident on the tiled floor. Around them rose majestic arches and massive columns, stretching into the distance and creating an impressive perspective of the academy's long corridor. Alice and Gran walked down the long corridor of the academy, their footsteps echoing along the walls. Gran tried to break the silence by addressing his companion, but the girl replied briefly, barely turning around, as if wanting to end the unpleasant conversation as soon as possible. The man fell into thought, raising a finger to his lips. He couldn't understand why she allowed an arrogant aristocrat to treat her this way. After all, in this educational institution, ability should be the primary criterion, not background. Alice's face darkened, and her gaze dropped. She felt vulnerable, realizing she had neither an influential lineage nor outstanding magical power that could protect her from such attacks. Gran looked genuinely puzzled. His posture expressed bewilderment at the situation. Then Alice turned her head slightly toward him, and her expression became serious and determined. She explained that it was all due to Samir's special status as a mage. This news caught Gran off guard. He froze in place, as if surrounded by an invisible aura of surprise, and asked again, trying to grasp the full significance of this information. Alice walked beside him and patiently explained the structure of their society to Gran. She told her companion that in the modern world, there is a clear concept of a suitable profession. The girl explained that every person is destined for a specific calling, which can be determined based on their innate talents and current abilities. As she spoke, images of various archetypes seemed to emerge, from warriors to mages, whose silhouettes embodied the diversity of paths open to people. Gran listened to her, and his face betrayed genuine surprise. Deep down, he was stunned by what he had heard. While he had slept for several hundred years, the world around him had changed beyond recognition. Continuing her explanation, Alice told him that, as a rule, a special assessment is conducted during the second year of high school. During this test, students are told which profession suits them best. Alice continued her explanation, and an image of Samir, with his arrogant smile and loyal entourage, popped into her mind. She noted with bitterness that among the suitable professions were popular and prestigious ones, such as mage or knight, who were always on the front lines and shone in the spotlight. However, she added that there were also professions whose practitioners were forced to remain in the shadows. Looking straight ahead, Alice gave a specific example that was painful for her. With a serious expression, she named the profession of Necromancer, implying that this particular specialty belonged to those who remained forgotten and unpopular. Gran listened to her attentively and fell into thought for a moment. Resting his hand on his hip, he looked at the girl with a new understanding of the situation. He realized that Alice herself was the very shadow he had been talking about. A thought flashed through his mind. Now he understood why she was trying so desperately to prove her worth, despite the mockery. Then the man decided to ask for more details about her training. He surmised that her class was made up of those who hadn't landed a suitable profession and bluntly called it a class of outsiders. Alice lowered her gaze, and a shadow of sadness and humility fell across her face. She quietly confirmed his guess, acknowledging her status as an outcast within the academy's walls. Alice continued her explanation, her gaze becoming serious and slightly sad. She admitted that there were plenty of people around who looked at her with contempt, just like Samir. The girl noted that simply having an unpopular profession was enough to make you feel as though your future was already closed off and predetermined by society. Gran watched her from the sidelines, a look of deep thoughtfulness on his face. He remained silent for a while, digesting her words, and then remarked that, although her reasoning sounded convincing and logical on the surface, in reality, everything turned out to be much more complicated and tangled than it seemed at first glance. However, her mood changed abruptly. Alice strode forward resolutely, demonstrating that she had no intention of giving up. She declared that the existence of prejudice did not mean she was going to surrender. On the contrary, she simply did not consider the situation so clear-cut and hopeless, refusing to accept the constraints imposed upon her. A dazzling smile, full of sincere determination, lit up Alice's face. She leaned forward, and her eyes sparkled with confidence, as if she could already see her future triumph. The girl declared loudly and clearly that even if necromancy was considered a profession for losers, she would achieve success at any cost. Gran's reaction was immediate. His eyes widened in utter surprise and shock. He was completely stunned by such a sudden burst of ambition and unyielding will from his young mistress, whom he might not yet have fully figured out. Alice, whose face was once again lit up with confidence, pointed her finger energetically at Gran, announcing her grand plans. She declared that to achieve success, she would have to become a true necromancer. Her immediate goal was to gather worthy familiars, and she looked at him with immense enthusiasm. Gran listened to her carefully and calmly asked if that meant he would have to help her with this as well. The girl immediately confirmed that it was, of course, a given. She resorted to a trick, promising to provide him with everything he needed: clothing, food, and shelter. In return, she asked him to help with at least this task, looking at him with a pleading yet determined expression. Gran watched her sudden change of mood and thought to himself how quickly she had pulled herself together after her recent doubts. At that moment, a loud cry rang out from somewhere nearby, drawing their attention. Two new girls appeared in the academy hallway, interrupting Alice's thoughts. The first to catch her eye was a tall girl with long, flowing blonde hair that reached her waist, adorned with ribbons. She radiated calm and kindness, her face lit by a soft, friendly smile. Standing next to her was another girl whose appearance was more reserved. She was wrapped in a dark cloak with a deep hood, from under which only her face was visible, with a short bob and calm, attentive eyes. Both girls greeted Alice. She enthusiastically returned their greetings, addressing them by name, Mira and Lily. Mira, The girl with long hair noted with relief that she was glad to see Alice in such high spirits today. Mira froze for a moment in confusion, looking at her friend's companion and asking who it was. After Alice introduced her friends to Gran, she proudly confirmed that he was her first animated familiar. Mira looked at the new familiar with genuine interest. However, her curiosity quickly turned to shock when, with her eyes wide open, she suggested that Gran must be a zombie, since he had been resurrected by a necromancer. Gran was clearly offended by the comparison. He wouldn't tolerate such treatment, and, approaching the girl with a stern look, demanded that she take a closer look at him. After declaring that he was by no means a ghoul, Mira began to apologize. The next second, Mira was already sobbing, clinging to Alice. The girl, hugging her distraught friend, turned sternly toward Gran and scolded him for scaring and hurting her friend instead of being friendly. Gran complained that he'd been called a zombie, and that it had deeply hurt his feelings. Mira felt a little embarrassed and hurried to apologize for her sharpness and how things had turned out. She nervously bit her finger and, stumbling over her words, introduced herself, giving her full name, Mira Azure. Gran looked at her closely and immediately noted to himself that her desire to vanish from his sight right then and there was so strong that he could almost physically feel it. It wasn't hard for him to understand her feelings. After that, his gaze shifted to the second companion. The girl in the dark hood, without uttering a word, continued to stare intently and attentively at him with her wide, open eyes. The girl in the dark hood calmly stepped forward and formally introduced herself. She called herself Lily and greeted her new acquaintance, though her face remained completely impassive. Gran immediately noticed this peculiarity. It seemed to him that there was absolutely no emotion on her face. She looked imperturbably calm. Alice decided to clarify the situation for her familiar and approached him. She whispered to him that her friends were very different. Mira felt extremely uncomfortable around men, which was why her reaction had been so intense and emotional. As for Lily, such calmness and a lack of dramatic reactions were her usual state. Gran listened to the explanation and nodded, indicating that he understood everything and accepted the behavioral quirks of Alice's new acquaintances. However, Gran was preoccupied with another question that had arisen after their introduction. He noticed with surprise that Lily hadn't given her last name and immediately wondered if she might be of common birth. Alice, not the least bit embarrassed, instantly confirmed his guess, calmly replying that she was, and asked if it mattered at all. Gran paused for a moment, as if pushing some thoughts aside, and quietly said that everything was fine. Just then, Mira called out to Alice, reminding her that class was about to start. Without turning back, the girls walked on. Alice hurried after her friends, calling out for them to wait for her. Gran watched them go, and he couldn't shake his genuine surprise that these girls were actually interacting with one another, completely disregarding their backgrounds and social status, something that was a great rarity within the walls of this academy. Gran, stretching as he walked, announced that he would find a way to pass the time while the lesson lasted, and, as he said goodbye, he warned his mistress not to fall asleep in class. Alice, walking beside him, timidly asked him to wait, and not to show off. Gran turned to her and calmly assured her that he understood everything. The academy's majestic dome obscured the sky, towering over the building. The school's massive brick walls stood proudly, surrounded by lush greenery. The building's architecture underscored the significance of this place, where the world's future mages and warriors were to be trained. Gran decided to keep his word and not distract Alice during class. He found something to occupy himself with while waiting. He settled onto the wide windowsill by a tall window through which soft daylight streamed in. Next to him, on the floor, lay an impressive stack of books that he had apparently managed to find nearby. The young man held one of the books in his hands and, with a serious, focused expression, was engrossed in reading. Gran reflected on how, to the common folks studying at the academy, the world might seem like a perfectly peaceful place. However, he understood that in reality, this was not the case at all. Information about the continent's geopolitical situation came to mind. According to Alice, Firma was the weakest kingdom on the entire continent. This state was sandwiched between two great powers, Weska and Destania. The situation was extremely tense. War could break out at any moment, and everything around them was already preparing for it. Images of the coats of arms of two great nations flashed through his mind. Destania, featuring a bird of prey, and Weska, featuring a unicorn, separated by lightning bolts. He remembered that these two powers were locked in a state of mutual deterrence. It was precisely thanks to this fragile balance that Firma had managed to survive so far, preventing it from being swallowed up by its stronger neighbors. Gran felt a growing weariness as he pondered how long this situation could possibly last. He had absolutely no desire to get involved in any trouble. Alice's words flashed through his mind, that she wanted exceptional familiars. Then he wondered if everything would be all right with her friends. Gran remembered how Mira had trembled with fear, admitting that she found men difficult, while Lily had simply stared into space. He reasoned that even if they were called familiars, in essence, they were the dead, and there were plenty of them. He didn't know Mira and Lily's professions, but it was obvious they weren't the type to charge in a battle right away. Gran smiled, deciding that these geopolitical complexities and Alice's worries ultimately had nothing to do with him. He snapped his fingers, and the books lying next to him on the floor instantly vanished with a loud sound. It seemed that morning classes were already coming to an end. Stretching, he thought that maybe he should go find something tasty. A view of the academy building. It shifted to the hallway where Gran was walking, his hands behind his head. The students, standing with their backs to him, were watching someone else, and one of them let out a puzzled sound. Suddenly, a sharp shout rang out. One of the students barked rudely at someone, insisting that what was happening had absolutely nothing to do with him, and demanded that the other person understand this. A loud, commanding voice echoed down the hallway, causing those around him to freeze. Gran stopped and watched the scene unfold from the sidelines with interest. The academy's majestic hall, with its black and white checkered floor and wide staircase, was filled with students. A buzz of voices surrounded him. Gran, watching the commotion, thought his mistress had gotten herself into some kind of trouble again. He saw Alice standing among the other students, and he decided to call out to her. Gran called to his mistress, asking her if they had gotten into a fight. Alice turned at his voice with a surprised expression, recognizing him, and quietly said his name. Gran raised his hand in greeting, addressing the aristocrats present as my lords with a touch of irony. He asked if they were really arguing again. Samir immediately objected, stating that it wasn't a quarrel at all. Gran, however, thought to himself that if he continued to behave this way, people would surely come to hate him soon. Samir, standing opposite him, looked extremely arrogant. Crossing his arms over his chest, he declared that trash should be treated like trash. He claimed he had merely offered advice and laughed loudly at his own words. Gran stood silently beside him, maintaining complete calm and composure. His face remained impassive, showing no signs of emotion. Alice stood there, clearly disgusted. Her gaze was full of contempt and disapproval of what was happening. Her lips slightly pursed, and her entire demeanor showed just how unpleasant the current situation was to her. Mira and Lily looked worried. Mira pressed her hands to her chest. Her eyes expressed anxiety and concern for her friend. Lily, though she maintained relative calm, also showed signs of unease in her gaze. All four stood in tense silence, waiting to see how things would unfold. Alice stood facing Samir, her face expressing outrage at his words about trash. She repeated his insulting remark, unable to believe her ears. Mira and Lily watched the scene unfold from the sidelines. Alice asked in horror if he really believed that trash should crawl like trash. Gran stood nearby, resting his hand on his chin in a pensive pose. He smiled, realizing that he'd thought Samir was just a nasty piece of work, but it turned out the man was speaking sense. His face betrayed an unexpected approval of the aristocrat's words. Alice, seeing her familiar's reaction, cried out in horror, urging Gran to take it easy. Gran raised his hand, addressing Samir, and said that he largely agreed with his opinion. Samir looked annoyed, while Alice watched the scene in bewilderment. Then Gran smiled and asked a counter-question. He wondered why a nobody like Samir wasn't still crawling on ground. Samir was extremely outraged by Gran's words and cried out in surprise. He immediately decided to assert his status, proudly declaring that he was the eldest son of the great noble house of Andrich, and that his profession was that of mage. Stretching his arm forward, he pointed at those around him, calling them stinking trash mongrels who were obligated to revere him. Alice, Mira, and Lily were shocked by such a burst of arrogance. Gran, however, remained unperturbed and calmly asked, "What's this all about?" He asked what this noisy young man's name was. Samir shouted his full name in a rage. Gran remarked mockingly that the name sounded like an insect, and noted that those creatures really do love to make noise. These words finally sent Samir over the edge. He shook with rage. Samir took off his glove and threw it at Gran's feet, loudly shouting a challenge to a duel. Gran stood motionless, not making the slightest movement. His face expressed complete calm and confidence. The girls froze in surprise at this turn of events. Their faces showed shock and anxiety. The action shifted to the training ground, a vast courtyard surrounded by high stone walls. Alice, now in the stands, was in complete shock at what was happening. A huge crowd of curious students had already gathered around the arena. Alice clutched her head in despair, complaining that she had asked them not to draw attention to themselves. She wondered why things always ended up this way with him. Alice reproached Gran for treating her merely as a nominal host and not listening to her at all. Gran calmly replied that he had no intention of apologizing, and advised her that if she wanted to stop all this, she should turn to the one who had proposed the duel. The girls in the stands watched the events unfold in surprise. Mira remarked admiringly that, judging by the situation, it seemed as though Gran had stood up for Alice. Lily was baffled by what had happened. Alice, meanwhile, mused that Gran was simply getting a kick out of the whole situation. Gran's opponent is Samir, a mage. Alice, looking at her opponent, realized that this was a whole different level, incomparable to a necromancer, even though Gran had easily deflected her magic. Samir smirked and suggested that Gran apologize right now, promising to forgive him if he did. Gran scratched the back of his head, clearly annoyed by the drawn-out situation. He called what was happening nonsense and demanded they finally get started and stop wasting time. However, upon seeing his opponent's reaction, Gran realized that Samir really did seem intent on truly angering him. Tossing a coin, Samir announced that the duel would begin as soon as it hit the ground. Alice watched the proceedings with anxiety. She understood that to defeat Samir, Gran absolutely had to strike first, right from the start of the fight. The knowledge that every mage had a single weak point came to mind. It is the moment when a spell is just being cast. In that split second, a mage is always, even if only slightly, open to attack. Gran stood calmly in the arena, waiting for the right moment to strike. Alice continued to think that if she missed this moment, Samir would gain a huge advantage on the battlefield. As soon as the coin Samir had tossed hit the ground, he instantly moved into the air directly above Gran. The guy, however, didn't react to this at all. Alice froze in bewilderment at what was happening. The spectators behind her were discussing Gran's strange behavior, noting that he stood motionless as if rooted to the spot. Meanwhile, Samir formed a massive ball of flame in his palm. He admitted to himself that he didn't understand his opponent's intentions. As he cast the spell, he thought that Gran should at least try not to die right away. Samir launched a powerful fireball straight at Gran. The flames roared toward the motionless figure, raising swirls of sparks and heat. Gran remained standing in place, not moving a muscle. He merely crossed his arms over his chest, calmly watching the approaching fiery element. His face showed neither fear nor agitation, only complete composure in the face of the attack. Gran raised his palm to meet the fiery attack. His face showed determination and focus. He thrust his arm forward, intending to intercept or deflect the fireball hurtling toward him. In that very second, all the fire energy evaporated at Gran's hand. The boy merely cast a cold glance toward his opponent. The spectators in the stands and Alice's friends froze, in complete shock. Their faces showed utter astonishment at what had happened. Samir looked stunned, his eyes wide with disbelief. Gran stood calmly, as if nothing had happened. Alice was puzzled. What had just happened? It seemed to her that he had absorbed the flame. Samir spun around, his voice trembling with anger and confusion. He demanded an explanation of what exactly the man had done. The crowd in the stands buzzed with questions. Gran, however, replied sarcastically that he was simply putting out a fire. Gran's words stung the aristocrat, and he ordered him not to mock him in this way. Gran suggested that Samir make a bet right in the middle of the duel. He laid out the terms. If he won, the aristocrat would be obligated to feed him. Samir coldly remarked that Gran was too confident. The young man immediately added that without such excitement, the duel would be boring. However, the mention of boredom clearly stung the aristocrat. After asking again with a dangerous tone, he couldn't hold back. Samir's face contorted with rage, and he shouted furiously that he'd had enough of such jokes. Stretching his arms forward, he began to form a magic circle for an attack. Samir activated a massive magic circle in front of him, from which gigantic streams of fire burst forth. The flames surged forward, filling the entire arena. Gran had no choice but to take the full brunt of the attack and try to block it. The fiery assault engulfed the spot where Gran stood, causing a massive explosion. Clouds of smoke and sparks shot up into the sky, completely obscuring the young man's figure. Alice, watching from the stands, froze in horror. Her eyes widened with fear for her familiar. In desperation, she shouted Gran's name, hoping he had survived this devastating attack. Alice rushed down the stairs, ignoring her friends who were trying to catch up with her and calling out after her. Watching the thick smoke rising above the arena walls, she prayed desperately that Gran hadn't died. Inside the arena, amidst the wisps of smoke, Samir stood with a maniacal grin. He laughed, wiping his face, and declared that Gran himself was to blame for everything, because it was Gran who had driven him to such fury. Samir, who had just been celebrating after a powerful attack, suddenly collapsed to his knees. His body buckled under invisible pressure. He let out pain sounds as he tried to stay on his feet. The aristocrat was completely baffled by what was happening and couldn't understand the nature of the sudden pressure that had come crashing down on him. Against the backdrop of smoke and the remnants of fire dissipating around the arena, the silhouette of Gran emerged, standing straight, motionless, as if nothing had happened. His figure radiated a calm, yet overwhelming power, which was the source of the pressure that had immobilized Samir. Seeing him, Samir couldn't comprehend the situation or how such a thing was even possible. Gran, standing amidst the smoke and clutching his chest, calmly replied that the attack had been quite powerful. However, he immediately added that it wouldn't hinder him in the slightest. His eyes flashed with an ominous red light, and a confident smile appeared on his face. Extending his arm forward, he pointed his finger at his opponent, and using his magic, he forced Samir to collapse to the ground. His body was pinned to the ground by an invisible force. Gran coldly declared that trash should crawl like trash, using the aristocrat's own words against him. Samir writhed on the ground, unable to get up. He let out pained sounds and cried out in despair that Gran was nothing more than a familiar. The aristocrat couldn't understand why he was using spatial magic. Gran stood in the arena, stretching his arm forward, and imperiously ordered Samir to crawl on his knees. Samir, in response, screamed in shock, insisting that in their world, this was a magic only a handful of mages could use. While the aristocrat raved about the inaccessibility of such power, Gran remained silent. His face showed no emotion, only a serious gaze fixed on his opponent. Gran stood amidst the clouds of smoke, a confident and slightly arrogant smile lighting his face. He calmly responded to Samir's earlier exclamations about the nature of his magic. Gran posed a rhetorical question, asking why Samir was surprised. Then he simply declared that he was the strongest in this world. Samir, lying on the ground in complete shock, uttered the name Alice Red Ashley. He asked, who does she control, and what kind of monster does she keep in her service? Gran made a gesture with his hand and smirked, asking if they were calling him a monster. He noted that scoundrels like him always reacted the same way. At that moment, Alice, standing in the distance in the arena, screamed, demanding that Gran stop. Gran heard her voice, and his expression changed. Alice, flushed all over, exclaimed that the fight was already over. She reminded Gran that he was, in fact, her familiar, and that he could at least obey her now. Gran, folding his arms across his chest, smirked to himself, noting just how loud and brazen his mistress was. Alice shouted back, apologizing for being that way, and added that all he ever did was act smart anyway. Gran said that since he had one, Samir had to treat him to a steak made from top-grade A-class beef. Alice immediately pointed out that the school cafeteria didn't even serve that kind of meat. Suddenly, Gran found himself surrounded on all sides. A ring of 5 new opponents instantly closed in around Gran, taking up combat positions. The woman in the black dress pointed her staff at Gran and imperiously demanded that he stop. Gran fell silent upon hearing this intervention. Alice, seeing the newcomer, exclaimed in complete surprise that it was a teacher. Gran stood with his arms crossed, maintaining his composure, while the teacher behind him, dressed elegantly with long hair and an unusual headdress, held her staff at the ready. Alice watched the scene unfold with anxious surprise. The teacher addressed them, calling Alice Red Ashley and her familiar. Then she informed them that the academy director wanted to see them. Alice was clearly stunned by this sudden summons. Alice realized they were being summoned to the principal's office, and her heart skipped a beat with a sense of foreboding. She grew anxious. Could they really be expelled for what had happened? Gran turned to the teacher and rightly pointed out that it was Samir who had issued the challenge to a duel. Alice kept thinking that even if they managed to get off lightly, they still faced suspension from classes. Gran, continuing to speak, asked why then. Only the 2 of them were being summoned to the principal's office? The teacher didn't answer, remaining silent. The woman in black suddenly broke the silence and explained the reason for the summons. She stated that it had come to light that Gran was someone who was not allowed to return to life. Alice was shocked by this statement and gasped in surprise. Gran, however, took the news calmly and simply said that he understood everything. He remarked that the academy representatives didn't seem to have become too complacent from their peaceful lives, since they had figured everything out so quickly. The teacher didn't respond to him and simply remained silent. Alice was in shock from the words of the woman in black, which echoed in her head. She wondered, could Gran really be the one who cannot return to life? Before her mind's eye, images of the abandoned grave from which Gran had emerged at his call appeared. Then Gran laughed loudly, declaring that his energy had been restored and that now people would fall under his power. Alice froze. Gran noticed her state and asked why she was so frozen. The girl was still trying to collect her thoughts. After everything that had happened, and while riding in the carriage headed for the director's office, Gran reminded Alice of the bet they'd lost, a steak made from the finest cuts of meat. Alice was taken aback by these words. She was outraged by what he'd said. A panoramic view of the city unfolded before their eyes, with all the beauty of the numerous rooftops and the tower visible in the distance. Inside the carriage, Gran said she was lucky because the school director was a man who understood everything. Alice asked her familiar why he had hidden this important information from her. Gran merely chuckled mysteriously, propping his chin on his hand and sinking into thought. Alice, sitting across from him on the carriage's soft sofa, was clearly agitated and upset. She admitted that she had no idea about his true nature as the Demon King, and no one around her had seen fit to tell her about it. Alice stared at Gran with eyes full of indignation. Noticing this, Gran explained that he hadn't chosen that nickname for himself. It was given to him by those around him, even though he was just an ordinary person. Alice turned her head to the side and asked what her companion meant by his previous words. Gran explained that anyone would inevitably feel fear towards someone who possessed immeasurable power. Then he spoke about himself, saying that in this world he had lost all hope and attachment, simply sinking into a deep sleep. A faint smile appeared in the young man's face as he concluded that he had simply grown tired of existing in such a state. Alice didn't immediately grasp the meaning of her companion's words and asked him to clarify what he had said. Her hands instinctively grabbed Gran's hand. Soon, understanding lit up her face, and the girl said that the situation was now clear to her. She leaned forward, her eyes glistening with tears of emotional relief, and sparkling sparks of joy appeared around her face. Clasping his hand, Alice declared enthusiastically that Gran, like herself, had turned out to be an outcast. Gran looked extremely surprised and bewildered by the sudden turn of the conversation. Alice, on the other hand, was beaming with delight. She suggested they build a relationship, given their similarities. The young man tried to object, insisting that they were not at all alike and should not be lumped together. However, the girl ignored his words. Alice asked if, to the greatest Demon King, she was considered nothing more than a tiny, microscopic creature. Gran replied that such a comparison would be an insult even to the microscopic creatures themselves. Alice was utterly astonished by such a harsh response. Gran decided to broach a serious topic and asked Alice to listen to him. He asked if her behavior would have been different had she known about his status as the Demon King beforehand. The girl didn't hesitate and immediately answered in the affirmative with confidence. She explained that she had originally been looking for a strong familiar, so the current situation was actually advantageous for her. Gran's expression remained serious and slightly pensive at his companion's unexpected reaction. Gran was slightly taken aback by such a passionate reaction. Alice, on the other hand, looked genuinely impressed. She noted that her familiar truly had enough courage. The girl reasoned that otherwise, he would never have risked trying to raise the status of such an unlucky profession as a necromancer. Then her attention shifted to the circumstances of his awakening. Alice was outraged by the fact that no one had declared Gran's grave a restricted zone. She critically assessed the work of the management system, calling the ability to enter so easily sheer negligence. A look of determination flashed in her eyes. The girl came to the conclusion that she herself would have to intervene in government affairs and carry out reforms to correct such negligence. Gran smiled as he looked at his companion and admitted that he actually liked those traits of her character. Alice quietly thanked him for his words. However, her gaze soon filled with anxiety. She voiced her fears about the possible resurrection of the Demon King, realizing that if the whole world found out about it, a great disaster would ensue. The girl also recalled the moment of the duel, apologizing and admitting that she didn't want to experience those agonizing thoughts about her familiar's possible death again. Gran, however, treated the potential threat with extreme nonchalance. He confidently declared that no one would dare challenge him in this world and advised the girl to take better care of herself. At that moment, the carriage pulled up to a massive stone building with tall windows and elegant balconies. Alice let out a quiet gasp of surprise as she looked at their destination through the carriage window. A loud exclamation rang out in the spacious hall with its tall columns and people. The head of the Ashley household, Jarbador Red Ashley, a man with gray hair, a thick mustache, and a beard, dressed in a formal uniform with epaulettes, excitedly called out his daughter's name. Alice calmly turned to him and quietly said that he was her father. Gran stood behind her, maintaining her composure and folding her arms across her chest. Jarbador immediately rushed over to the girl and grabbed her by the shoulders, his face betraying extreme concern. He asked if she was hurt and if she was all right. The man also mentioned the rumors he'd heard about his daughter's clash with a rival from the House of Andre. Alice noted to herself that the news had already reached his ears. Gran casually informed Jarbador that he had settled the conflict with that guy. After all, protecting one's master is a familiar's self-evident duty. Jarbador enthusiastically shook Gran's hand, expressing his gratitude that the situation that had arisen just yesterday had already been resolved today. The man asked if they had managed to keep the punishment to a minimum, to which Alice replied with a slight hesitation. Alice stood to the side, pondering just how much her father knew. She was troubled by the thought that if he knew about the duel with Samir, he might also know Gran's true nature. At that moment, Jarbador noticed his daughter's state. He observed that she lacked her usual cheerfulness today and asked what had happened. Jarbador turned to his daughter, strongly urging her to rest today. He promised that later he would have something useful made for her and would personally bring it to her. While her father was speaking, two maids in uniform approached Alice from behind. One of them noticed that the girl's clothes were stained, and they were about to lead her to the bathroom. Alice reacted with confusion to such active concern, not having time to object. Meanwhile, Jarbador turned his attention to Gran. He put a friendly arm around the young man's shoulder and suggested celebrating the victory with good food and drink. Gran readily agreed, saying he'd skipped lunch and was terribly hungry. Alice watched the scene unfold, utterly amazed at how easily they'd hit it off. Left alone with her thoughts, Alice looked worried. She wondered if everything would really turn out all right. Her gaze shifted to the spacious bedroom with a massive four-poster bed, where a chandelier hung from the ceiling and framed paintings adorned the walls. It was in this very room that she was to stay. Burying her face in the pillows on the soft bed, Alice felt a sudden wave of fatigue wash over her. The bedding creaked slightly under her weight. Lying in an uncomfortable position, she pondered her father's behavior. The man acted as if nothing unusual had happened, but the girl understood that the current situation did not bode well for the Ashley family. In the silence of the room, Alice lay on the spacious bed. Her gaze fell on a large family portrait in an ornate frame, depicting her parents and child. She was aware of her responsibility. As a member of a historic family, she had to serve as a role model for those around her. However, portraits of ancestors in oval and rectangular frames hung on the wall nearby, a reminder of strict traditions. Looking at them, Alice considered herself a disgrace to the family, despite her respectable profession. The incident involving Gran's resurrection seemed to her an unprecedented event that could cast a shadow on their name. Lying on the bed, Alice gave in to anxious thoughts. She was convinced that the current circumstances would completely disgrace her father and ruin his reputation. Yesterday evening came to mind. When she introduced Gran, the head of the Ashley household was incredibly delighted, declaring that this was exactly the result one should expect from their lineage. At that moment, the girl enthusiastically declared Gran her #1 familiar, feeling proud of her choice. However, reality quickly brought her back to her current worries. Alice tossed and turned helplessly on the soft pillows, feeling powerless in the face of the situation. Suddenly, it dawned on her. The girl sat up abruptly in bed, realizing the unpredictability of her familiar. She understood that Gran was capable of controlling their relationship on a whim. This realization led her to a decisive conclusion. She needed to come up with a simple plan immediately to keep him by her side. Alice sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of books. Her face showed determination and a hint of irritation. She was firmly resolved that she could not fail again. Various volumes lay scattered around her, and in the margins of her notes were jotted down reflections on Gran's nature. Though he was a demon, he was still human. The girl understood that she needed proper preparation to carry out her plan. Gran was walking down a spacious corridor with high ceilings. Massive bookshelves lined the walls, and an elegant chandelier hung from the ceiling. At the end of the corridor, a closed door could be seen, leading to another part of the room. Gran was enjoying the space he had been given. He stretched with a satisfied look on his face. The young man noted that the place was simply magnificent, and now he could drink fine wine without any restrictions. His black shoes tapped against the hallway floor as he made his way toward the door. Gran believed that following Alice had been the right decision. After standing in silence for a moment, he approached the wooden door with decorative panels. He swung it open and stepped inside. In the room, Alice was standing by the bed, above which an elegant chandelier hung from the ceiling. Hearing the door open, she spun around sharply over her shoulder. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw who had entered. The girl let out only a quiet gasp of surprise, not expecting Gran to arrive so soon. The young man found himself in the room and, with a hint of puzzlement, asked why the girl was there, considering that night had already fallen. Alice looked flustered, her hands clenched nervously, betraying her intense agitation, which was underscored by the trembling of her fingers. Gathering her courage, she declared that she had a very important conversation to have. Gran reacted with complete bewilderment. His gaze conveyed a silent question. In the end, they found themselves standing face to face in the spacious room, a tense silence hanging in the air. Gran stood with his back turned to her and announced his intention to go to sleep, suggesting they postpone the conversation until the next day. Alice couldn't accept this and exclaimed loudly, demanding that he wait. The young man sat down wearily on the edge of the bed, looking impatient. He muttered quietly, asking what exactly was going on. Then he demanded that she tell him quickly what she needed. The girl pressed her hand to her chest and sincerely thanked him for all the help he had given her that day. Gran remarked that although he had received many complaints, he didn't recall asking for thanks for it. Alice immediately corrected him, insisting that wasn't the point at all. She explained that after the upcoming duel, Samir would stop harassing her, and people at the academy would no longer look at her askance. Standing before Gran, the girl added that she didn't know what the punishment would be, but life at the academy would definitely become more comfortable. Gran listened to her arguments and replied that since his mistress said so, he accepted it without objection. Then the young man asked what exactly he could do for her. Alice hesitated slightly, taken aback, not knowing how to answer the question. Alice reminded him that for now, they were bound only by a preliminary agreement, but that this wasn't the final arrangement. She boldly confessed her desire for Gran to become her familiar forever. The girl stood before him in a light gown with numerous ruffles. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but her gaze remained resolute. She took a step toward him, and the fabric of her dress rustled softly in the tense silence of the room. Alice explained that this was why she was ready to repay him in a completely different way. The young man remained completely silent, not uttering a sound in response to her words, while the girl insisted on her proposal. Gran looked at her with genuine surprise, his mouth slightly agape. He wondered where his mistress could have learned such behavior. His question caught Alice off guard. She looked up at him, her eyes full of bewilderment, and let out a sound of confusion, completely unprepared for such a response. Alice tried to justify herself, citing a book titled The Best Book for a Girl. She explained that according to the book, if you devote yourself to the one you want to win over, you might be able to create a strong bond. Gran immediately reacted to this, asking what exactly she was reading. He warned her against blindly trusting printed materials and advised her not to put everything into practice indiscriminately. The girl insisted on her own way, claiming that the problem lay more with him. She wondered how else one could understand feelings if not through practice. Gran looked at her and suddenly realized why her father, Jarbador, was so worried. He admitted to himself that Alice was so vulnerable that it was impossible not to protect her, though there was a certain charm in that. The young man surmised that she had resurrected him with only a superficial understanding. Alice, meanwhile, found it strange that her attempt had no effect on him at all. Gran asked seriously whether her desire to make him her familiar forever was truly driven solely by her own ambitions. Alice quietly confirmed her intentions, though doubt shone through in her voice. She admitted that what was happening seemed too good to be true, but she continued to explain her position nonetheless. The girl mentioned that her father also feels kindly toward Gran and is one of the few people who truly understand her. The young man sighed heavily. He pointed out to Alice that even her father, Jarbador, had asked him for help. Gran smiled, noting how much trust both father and daughter placed in him. Gran broke the heavy silence with an unexpected question. He asked Alice what she would do if he suddenly decided to betray her. Alice was caught off guard by this turn of the conversation. She froze in place, nervously clasping her hands in front of her, and at first could only manage to utter indistinct sounds as she tried to formulate a thought. However, her shock quickly gave way to resolve. The girl declared that in that case, she would simply stop him. Gran smiled, noting that this was exactly the kind of behavior he'd come to expect from his fearless mistress. He assured Alice that he understood her resolve. The girl stood before him in her light attire, listening intently to every word. The young man explained that he couldn't promise to stay forever, but he was ready to repay her at least for bringing him back to life. His gaze grew slightly playful as he asked her not to let him get bored. Alice heard these words, and a happy smile lit up her face. Her cheeks flushed with joy and relief. Alice exclaimed joyfully, expressing her sincere gratitude to Gran, and threw her arms up in a burst of emotion. Gran cut off her exclamations, beginning to speak of matters of priority. Touching his lips with his fingers, he shifted his attention to her attempts at seduction. He calmly remarked that if she truly intended to pursue this path, she needed to approach the matter more seriously. The girl stood before him in her light attire, listening to his criticism. The young man bluntly advised her to improve her private parts. Alice froze in complete shock, her face flushing deeply with embarrassment and surprise. Gran, however, flatly declared that her current appearance did not arouse him at all. Alice stormed out of the room in anger, turning back to Gran as she ran. Her face was flushed with embarrassment and rage. She loudly declared that she would never appear before him like that again and called him a fool. Gran remained seated on the bed, calmly watching her leave. He merely noted to himself how loud she was. Day had turned to evening, illuminating the estate with a view of the starry night sky, covered in dark clouds. The old man folded his hands together in a gesture of contemplation. The sleeves of his clothes were adorned with an intricate pattern. The unknown man wondered what kind of idiot could have resurrected the Lord of Demons. A council of necromancers had gathered around the table. The main topic of their meeting was Alice. A man clad in a dark robe, wearing a mask, and sporting a long beard, continued his speech after the agenda was announced. He called Alice a cheeky girl who was meddling in matters not her own. Another necromancer, younger than the previous one, wearing the same robe but a different mask, began to say that after such a long slumber, the Lord of Demons had no choice but to surrender once more to the embrace of Morphus. Another member of the lodge, a young necromancer with black hair, believed that this would prove to be no easy task for the Lord of Demons. The meeting participants continued to discuss the situation. One of the necromancers wondered what could possibly be so difficult. After all, they were talking about Alice, and he assumed she simply needed to be given the appropriate order. Another doubted whether the girl would comply with their demands. However, their interlocutor corrected his colleagues, stating that this was not the issue at all. He revealed the crux of the situation. The contract had already been terminated, and now the parties were acting solely under a preliminary agreement, effectively working together. This news shocked those present. One of the lodge members realized the inevitability of the consequences. If the contract was terminated, the familiar was finished. He clarified that there was only one possible outcome in such a case, and he waved his hand to the side, announcing that he was terminating the contract, and the skeleton immediately collapsed to the ground. The man reminded those present that if the contract is terminated, the familiar inevitably perishes. The skeleton lying on the floor served as a grim confirmation of these words. For the necromancers, this rule was an unshakable axiom. However, the current situation made them question the usual order of things. One of the lodge members, wearing glasses, concluded that Lord of the Demons was such an unconventional being that he had managed to survive in defiance of the laws. Another necromancer, wearing a mask, expressed utter bewilderment at the girl's actions. He was concerned not only with how she had managed to infiltrate a heavily guarded location, but also with the very fact of resurrecting such a powerful entity. The third participant in the gathering, standing nearby, began to explain. He explained that on the day of the Demon Lord's resurrection, foreign spies had been spotted nearby. It was clarified that most of the staff had been sent to intercept them, which is why the tomb's security was weaker than usual. Based on this, it was surmised that the girl had stumbled upon the place by accident. One of those present expressed utter bewilderment. He refused to believe it was mere coincidence, wondering how she had managed to infiltrate a heavily guarded zone and perform a ritual to resurrect the Demon Lord himself. He objected, pointing out that, given the current situation, the events could only be interpreted in this way. His interlocutor insisted that now was not the time for arguments, demanding that they focus on the task at hand. The elderly man expressed serious concern that if anyone were to learn of the Demon Lord's resurrection, the proud name of the necromancers would be irrevocably disgraced. He insisted on the need to take immediate countermeasures. Then one of the masked attendees made an unexpected proposal, not to miss the opportunity and to use the Lord of Demons himself for their own purposes. His words puzzled a colleague, who asked him to clarify the meaning of such a proposal. The one who proposed the idea explained that this was a magnificent opportunity for their entire community. He declared that it would be better for the Lord of Demons to serve them, hinting at the significant benefits of the current situation. The meeting participants discussed the prospects opened up by the resurrection. It was suggested that, along with the Demon Lord's power, the bodies of powerful monsters would become available to them, and their ability to subjugate these monsters would increase significantly. The elderly man in glasses took this information in stride, as if pondering what had been said. However, he expressed doubt as to whether everything would go as smoothly as expected. Two younger members of the lodge discussed the success of the venture at a table with cups. One of them confidently remarked that the plan had to work at least once. His companion asked why he was so sure of that. Meanwhile, a specific plan of action regarding the girl had been formulated. It was decided to order Alice to carry out certain actions under the pretext of punishment for trespassing into forbidden territory. One of those present noted that since the Demon Lord was acting in concert with the girl, he would most likely support her. However, a proposal was made to consider the Academy's request to mitigate the punishment to avoid excessive severity. The lead necromancer sharply rejected these arguments, stating that he had no time to listen to such things. He said that since the girl was the Demon Lord's mistress, she must be given an appropriate punishment. The meeting's leader then moved on to specifics, reporting the appearance of a dragon near the royal capital. He asked if this arrangement would suit the others. Upon receiving consent and hearing no objections, a final decision was made. The necromancer's assembly was drawing to a close. The figures in dark hoods rose from their seats, and one of them proclaimed the glory of their order, concluding the meeting with a solemn cry. The next day, the Academy's exterior stood in all its grandeur, a massive building with a dome and numerous windows, adorned with intricate architecture. Two students were strolling through the school grounds. One of them turned to his companion, asking if he'd heard the latest news. He told him about a recent attack on an aristocrat in a neighboring class and mentioned that undead had appeared at their school. One of them remarked that if a person's profession is a necromancer, then society needs more familiars. Alice walked past them, her face clearly showing her displeasure. She had hoped that school life would get a little easier, but instead, those around her kept finding new reasons to pick on her. The girl believed that such an attitude was entirely to be expected from people who had encountered someone with an unpopular profession. When she reached the columns of the building, one of the boys noticed her and nudged his friend with his elbow. He whispered to his companion to keep his voice down, reminding him that her familiar had easily defeated Samir. The second student reacted with surprise, realizing exactly who was walking past. The girl heard the whispering, and a faint smile appeared on her face. She thought to herself that, despite everything, the impact of what had happened was still making itself felt. In the academy's training hall, Mira called out to Alice, expressing surprise at her appearance at school in her current state. Her friends asked about what had happened the previous day when the teacher had taken her away. Alice explained that she had spent almost the entire day in the principal's office, which genuinely astonished her friends. Then she revealed the nature of her punishment for causing a commotion. The girl is tasked with a specific mission to slay a dragon. Her friends were utterly shocked to hear about the upcoming task. Alice calmly tried to explain the situation, but her friends were agitated. Mira objected that only those bearing the title of hero could defeat a dragon. Lily cautiously suggested that it might be an ancient dragon. Alice corrected them, noting that they must be referring to a legendary-level creature whose name would go down in history. Mira continued her explanation, pointing out that there were many different types of these creatures. Even without considering the legendary ones, even the lowest rank posed a serious threat to humans. Mira asked which dragon Alice was planning to defeat. With a confident smile, Alice named the target of her mission, the red dragon. Her friends were instantly horrified by what they heard. One of them asked if she was joking. Meanwhile, the other struggled to say the monster's name, overcome with fear. Alice calmly confirmed that she was serious. Then the girl began to explain the creature's characteristics. She said that the red dragon was of medium rank or lower, but had an extremely hot temper. She also noted that these creatures almost never descended to human settlements, so their way of life remained shrouded in mystery. The discussion turned to the possible consequences of an encounter. Lily explained that despite their rarity, visits from such creatures are catastrophic. If a red dragon takes notice of a village or town, those places are almost instantly turned into scorched wastelands. She concluded that this creature is a true natural disaster. Mira asked why the punishment turned out to be exactly that. She told her friends that the director had tried to mitigate the sentence and did everything he could, though in the end he, too, considered this measure unjust. However, she understood deep down that the necromancers who ran the cemetery were extremely angry about Gran's resurrection. Moreover, the secret that Gran was once called the Lord of Demons is known only to a select few. Looking at Mira and Lily, the girl decided not to alarm them unnecessarily with dangerous details. Alice, her eyes shining, mused about the potential loot, noting how much they could get for the red dragon's carcass. She asked her friends if this wasn't a great opportunity. Mira looked worried and asked if she wasn't afraid to go on such a mission. Lily was quick to dispel her worries, saying that Alice had Gran, so everything would be fine. She added that it wouldn't be surprising if they actually managed to defeat the dragon. Inspired by this prospect, the girls began making plans. Mira agreed that with Gran, victory was quite likely. She noted that if they managed to turn the red dragon into a familiar, it would be incredible. Lily supported her, pointing out that making a name for herself as a necromancer could become a reality, not just a dream. Alice was inspired by her friend's words. Suddenly, Gran appeared nearby. He called out to the girls loudly, asking what they were doing there. Alice let out a startled scream at the surprise. She said his name and then asked what he meant. Gran crossed his arms over his chest and remarked that from the outside, it looked like they were just skipping class. The friends blushed and mumbled an excuse, saying they weren't exactly skipping class. Then the young man asked where their teacher was. Lily replied that he wasn't there. She explained that their class was made up of students with various unpromising professions. There wasn't enough budget or staff to provide a teacher for each of them individually. Gran asked if they really were so prejudiced against these unsuccessful professions. Alice confirmed that this was indeed the case. She explained that they were taught only theory. Furthermore, it was believed that even training in combat techniques would be of no use. The young man took this information in thoughtfully. He realized that this indicated the mediocrity of their skills, since self-study has its limits. Then Gran, standing in front of his friends, decided to ask for more details. He asked what their professions were. Lily admitted that she was a monster tamer. and Mira said she was a shaman who could control spirits. After that, Alice maliciously scolded Gran, noting that asking such a thing at the academy was shameless. Mira turned to Alice, trying to reassure her that everything was fine. Her friends reminded her that Gran was her familiar. They brought up yesterday's incident with Samir when he had been picking on Alice. The girl expressed regret that they should have helped but couldn't, while he had stood up for her instead. Gran thoughtfully rested his hand on his chin, analyzing what he had heard. To himself, he noted that one of the girls was a tamer, and the other a shaman capable of summoning spirits. While he was thinking, Mira and Lily watched him. Alice, meanwhile, was inwardly fretting over the situation. It seemed to her that the familiar had ruined the whole atmosphere with his question, and she mentally pointed out his reaction to her friends. However, the young man's thoughts ended on an unexpectedly positive note. He confidently declared that this was excellent and announced that he would take both of them with him on a dragon hunt. Alice was utterly astonished by Gran's unexpected proposal. She loudly expressed her disbelief, exclaiming, "What are you talking about?" and demanding an explanation. Her emotional outburst could be heard throughout the academy grounds. Soon the group left the school grounds and headed toward the forested mountains, where they were to face a dangerous enemy. A covered carriage drawn by horses set off along a winding road through the trees. Gran took the reins, confidently steering the carriage deeper into the territory where the dragon dwelled. Inside the carriage, Lily asked why they needed to go on this trip in the first place. Alice admitted that she didn't know the answer herself. She apologized to her friends, explaining that Gran hadn't told her anything. The girl noted that by the time she got into the carriage, the girls were already inside. She thought to herself that she was, after all, the familiar's mistress, but she hadn't been informed. The girls expressed concern that they might be a burden on the trip. They wondered if everything would go smoothly if they went along with them. Alice advised her friends not to worry. She recalled Gran's words, who had described the upcoming task as an encounter with some sort of huge lizard, thereby downplaying the danger. The girls were stunned by such a flippant description of a dragon. Alice tried to look on the bright side, reasoning that Gran would surely handle the task on his own. For them, it was a great chance to go on a sort of educational excursion. Alice compared their journey to a picnic. Lily agreed with Alice and added that she had never before traveled in such a luxurious carriage. Alice and Mira agreed with her, noting that the weather was indeed perfect for a walk today. Gran stopped the carriage by the riverbank and suggested taking a break since there was water nearby. Alice looked out of the carriage and was delighted by the view that unfolded before her. The girls stepped outside, enjoying the surrounding scenery. They admitted that they hadn't even suspected such a picturesque place existed so close to the capital. However, Alice's enthusiasm soon gave way to a slight regret. She lamented that if she had known about this opportunity in advance, she would definitely have brought her swimsuit. Gran remarked that no one had expected to see Alice in a swimsuit. The girl sharply retorted that she wouldn't have put it on just for him. The young man hastened to apologize, but couldn't resist remarking that he had absolutely no interest in looking at her pitiful appearance in that modest outfit. Alice flew into a rage at those words. Imagining Mira in a swimsuit, Gran remarked that one might expect something from her. Gran also remarked that Lily seemed to be quite popular within a small circle of people. Alice was taken aback by the young man's words. Embarrassed, she asked him not to look at her friends with such a strange, appraising gaze. At that moment, a powerful blast shook the forest, creating a massive wave of energy that knocked over the trees around them. The girls were hit by a strong gust of wind, forcing them to brace themselves. Alice gasped in surprise, wondering what that roar she just heard was. Gran, however, remained unperturbed and even smiled. He noted that they were lucky, since the target had come to them on its own. A majestic and fearsome creature loomed over the water surface. A massive dragon hovered in the air, spreading its massive wings, which took up a significant portion of the sky. Its body was covered in thick scales that shimmered in the sun. The monster's head was adorned with imposing, curved horns, giving it an even more menacing appearance. The dragon's mouth was slightly open, revealing sharp teeth, and its eyes flashed with wild fury. Its powerful paws, equipped with long claws, were ready to strike at any moment. The four figures on the shore looked tiny against the backdrop of this colossal creature. The dragon loomed over them, displaying its superiority and readiness for battle. Its presence filled the entire space, creating an atmosphere of imminent danger. Upon seeing the monster appear, Alice froze in shock, managing to utter only an inarticulate sound. Gran, however, remained completely calm. Panic seized the girl. In terror, she cried out her familiar's name, asking if everything would really be all right. Gran tried to calm her down, warning that any unnecessary noise could provoke the monster into attacking and lead to dire consequences. Gran turned to Lily. The girl asked in surprise, "What happened?" The young man declared that he was going to kill the dragon right now and ordered her to follow him. Lily was completely bewildered by this turn of events. Alice and Mira were also stunned. Lily asked why he was taking her specifically. She reminded him that, according to the terms of the mission, it was Alice who was supposed to kill the dragon, and everything was supposed to happen differently. Gran merely stretched out thoughtfully, as if pondering her words. Gran smiled confidently and held out his hand. He told the girl that very soon she would see something amazing. Lily stared at him with wide eyes, making no attempt to hide her astonishment. The young man gestured for her to follow him. Lily froze in place, letting out only a quiet sound of bewilderment, but not moving from where she stood. Lily accepted the offer and reached out her hand in response, quietly agreeing. Suddenly, Gran swiftly scooped the girl up into his arms. She hadn't expected this turn of events and froze in surprise. Alice and Mira watched the scene, their faces expressing utter astonishment at what was happening. Alice screamed in horror, turning to Gran and demanding an explanation. At that moment, a magic circle activated beneath Mira and Alice's feet. Gran, still holding Lily in his arms, merely smiled confidently and told the girls to just stand there and watch what happened next. The friends watched the scene with bated breath. The young man held Lily firmly in his arms. He warned her to hold on tight so she wouldn't fall. Lily was so stunned that she could only mumble incoherently. Then the boy planted his feet firmly on the ground and announced the start of the flight. The girl let out only a stifled sound, completely at the mercy of his actions. Gran, holding Lily tightly in his arms, flew swiftly straight toward the enormous dragon. Lily was stunned by what was happening. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized how close they were to the monster's jaws. Gran thrust his leg forward, delivering a swift strike in mid-flight. Lily clung tightly to his clothes, her eyes wide with the horror of the situation. The girls watching from below were utterly astonished. One of them involuntarily gasped in surprise, not understanding what was happening. At that moment, a devastating blow struck the dragon. The monster's body jerked violently from the force of the impact, sending debris and dust flying in all directions. Gran remained calm and focused, despite the chaos of the battle. The dragon was enveloped in clouds of dust after the powerful blow. Gran descended to the ground, still holding Lily in his arms. Alice and Mira were inside the protective magic circle, trembling from the shock of what they had just experienced. Lily, looking toward where the enemy had been, assumed that Gran had killed the dragon. Gran, still holding the girl in his arms, turned to her. He asked if she knew why he had brought her along. Lily froze in confusion, trembling slightly from the tension she had just experienced. The young man decided not to keep her in suspense and offered to tell her everything himself. He suggested that she was just an ordinary tamer. The girl confirmed his guess. Gran asked Lily who, in her opinion, was standing before them. Lily hesitantly suggested that it was a dragon. The young man asked a counter-question. What kind of dragon was it? And what exactly was this creature? The girl was taken aback by the way the question was phrased. She tried to explain that a dragon was a monster, to which Gran replied in the affirmative. The enormous monster began to slowly rise after the crushing blow. The dragon opened its massive jaws, bearing rows of razor-sharp teeth. The beast's roar shook the air, creating waves of menacing energy. Gran, still holding Lily in his arms, calmly explained the nature of the creature to her. He told her that dragons are creatures that stand at the pinnacle of all races. He added that dragons are true monsters among all monsters. Lily stared at the gigantic creature, realizing the gravity of the situation. The dragon opened its mouth and unleashed a powerful, destructive stream of energy directly at them. The air around them trembled with the force of the attack. Despite the danger, Gran remained unflappable. He calmly asked Lily if she thought she wouldn't be able to handle this. The young man reminded her of her calling her a monster tamer, as if that were the key to victory. Gran didn't budge, facing head on the rushing torrent of energy that burst from the dragon's maw. A massive spiral vortex loomed menacingly over them, ready to devour everything in its path. A magic circle suddenly appeared beneath Gran's feet. Gran stood his ground against the powerful energy vortex emanating from his opponent, continuing to hold the girl tightly in his arms. At that moment, a sudden realization struck Lily. She wondered if, since she was indeed a monster tamer, she might even be able to subdue the red dragon. The young man answered her unspoken question. He confirmed that such an outcome was possible, but warned that it wouldn't happen right away. Gran explained that she would be able to achieve this once she had gained enough experience. The girl was extremely surprised by this answer. Lily, despite the horror she had just experienced, felt a surge of excitement. She realized that she had a unique opportunity to subdue the dragon. Lily clenched her fist, wondering how long it would take to reach that level. But in the end, she would at least have the chance to subdue a dragon. Gran looked at his companion and explained that things weren't quite as she imagined. He emphasized that tamers weren't weaklings at all and advised her not to be so pessimistic. The girl agreed. Gran said that the only payment for his help would be a ride on her dragon's back. Lily immediately agreed and promised to fulfill this condition. Then the girl timidly turned to him again. She asked if she could go with him when he went to tame the monster. Gran looked surprised by her request. Lily clasped her hands in supplication and asked hopefully if it was truly impossible. Gran didn't object to her request. He couldn't figure out if the girl was acting this way on purpose. After all, if that were the case, she was a true strategist. And he added that he didn't mind. The girl was delighted to hear this and immediately took Gran at his word. He noted that Alice could learn a thing or two about sincerity from Lily. After that, he shifted his gaze to the enormous dragon looming behind them and stated that they first needed to deal with the threat right in front of them. The dragon's massive jaws loomed over them, displaying its power. Gran explained to Lily the real reason for her presence here. He wanted her to learn a lesson about monster tamers. He pointed out to her that hunting a dragon isn't exactly the most pleasant sight for someone in his line of work. The young man explained that, in essence, it was simply a one-sided taking of life. Despite his words, Lily assured Gran that everything was fine. Gran gently set the girl down on the ground. Standing up, the young man declared that he would now act without hesitation. He looked at his companion seriously and warned her never to underestimate the enemy. Gran explained that for a monster tamer, even a moment of inattention could cost a life. Lily asked how things were going for him. The young man confidently declared that he was the strongest in the world. The girl doubted his words, asking if he wasn't overestimating himself. Gran simply disagreed. Gran insisted that it was simply the truth. Powerful magical energy began to concentrate in his palm, accompanied by flashes of violet lightning. His eyes stared intently ahead as he cast the spell. The young man released a massive beam of energy, directing it at his opponent. Alice was horrified by what she heard. She exclaimed in bewilderment, asking if it was truly impossible to subjugate the red dragon as a servant. Gran didn't answer right away, just looked at her silently with a puzzled expression. The defeated dragon lay on the ground. The young man asked her point blank if she was being foolish. He declared that a girl like her would never in her life be able to harness the power of the red dragon. Gran added that she shouldn't even try. Alice was outraged by these words and said that no one had ever told her such a thing. Gran told the girl that she didn't have enough magical power to enter into such a contract. Alice was shocked by this statement. Stammering, she asked again about the lack of power, but she objected, saying she had been able to resurrect him. The young man explained that he was an exception and asked if she even understood what an undead was. And did she fully grasp it? The girl confidently replied that of course she understood, calling them living corpses. Gran was outraged by Alice's words. He declared that she could have acquired more nuanced knowledge. Alice retorted, saying that she had been studying on her own all this time. Gran was slightly embarrassed, but still spoke the harsh truth. He declared that, in her normal state, she was practically no different from an ordinary person on the street. Alice sat down on the ground, feeling hurt that the young man had gone too far in his criticism, and she had been counting on them being able to get a red dragon's corpse. The young man noted that her very mention of it already showed her poor understanding of the subject. Alice began reminding herself of how she had accidentally performed the resurrection ritual from a book she'd found and unintentionally made Gran her familiar. The girl admitted that this was exactly why she'd neglected her studies. Gran decided to start by teaching her the basics. He explained that there is one mandatory condition for the undead. It does not arise naturally. Alice asked him to clarify exactly what he meant by that. Gran confirmed that he meant it literally. He explained that the undead he was referring to were known to humans. According to rumors, all of them were the creations of necromancers. Alice objected, noting that rumors of undead attacks weren't all that rare. An image from her childhood flashed before her eyes, people fighting the undead. Alice remembered that she herself had gone through something similar as a child. However, she was soon overcome with anxiety. The girl thought that if Gran's words were true, and such information became known to the world, necromancers would be treated even more horribly. Alice sought confirmation of the young man's words, asking if he was lying to her. Gran countered with a question of his own. Why would he even need to lie to her? The girl just exhaled quietly, feeling the tension. The young man explained that the current public perception of the undead had been shaped from scratch by the necromancers themselves over many years. That's why he wasn't surprised that people thought that way. Alice asked, confused, why would they need to do that? Gran admitted that he didn't know for sure, but he was certain they were definitely up to no good. Alice fell silent, lost in anxious thoughts. Gran assured the girl that he wasn't joking at all. Gran admitted that even though he's considered an undead, he's now forced to work with a necromancer for the rest of his life. Alice abruptly changed the subject and insisted on an explanation. Why couldn't she sign a contract with the Red Dragon right now? The young man agreed to explain the situation. He explained that first, the Necromancer infuses his magical power into the corpse. After the undead appears, the mage makes it his familiar. Gran continued his explanation, pointing out that this magical power becomes a sort of temporary life force for the undead. Alice asked for clarification. Gran confirmed this and said that the moment the contract is broken, the flow of magic stops, and the creature turns back into a corpse. Alice remarked in bewilderment that Gran looked completely unfazed. Gran once again pointed out his uniqueness. The girl was outraged by this answer and called the very existence of the Demon King an embodiment of injustice. The young man continued his explanation. He said that the magic level for ordinary undead is low, and the amount of magic required for resurrection can be estimated based on the race. Alice asked thoughtfully, "If I want to make a dragon my familiar, will it require a serious amount of magic?" Alice, inspired by the new possibilities, asked hopefully if she would truly be able to carry out her plan in the future. Gran confirmed her hopes. He explained that the main requirement was to increase the volume of her magical energy. The girl immediately lit up with a new question. A joyful smile lit up her face, her eyes sparkled, and she eagerly asked how exactly she could increase her magic reserves. The young man promised that he would definitely teach her this, but suggested postponing the practical lessons until their return. Then he steered the conversation toward their current situation. Alice agreed with him, noting that their first priority now was to explain what was happening to the person they had left waiting. Mira stood alone by a tree on the lakeshore, looking around. The silence and tranquility of the surrounding nature stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded here just moments ago. The girl remarked aloud that it was hard to believe a real battle had raged here only a few moments ago. It seemed as if nothing had happened, just the peaceful landscape around her, but her thoughts were far from calm. A recent moment flashed through her mind, when Gran had scooped Lily up in his arms and leaped. His strength at that moment had seemed simply overwhelming to her, incomparable to anything they had seen before. That memory still shook her, forcing her to realize the scale of his power. Her mind was tormented by questions about the strange turn of events. Mira wondered why Gran had made such an unexpected decision. She asked herself why he hadn't taken Alice, who was supposed to fight with him, but had taken Lily instead. Past events flashed through Myra's mind. Alice had run toward Lily across the field, arms outstretched. Her face showed genuine relief and concern. She had called out her friend's name loudly, asking if she was all right. The girls hugged each other warmly. Lily quietly confirmed that she was fine. Mira thought that the peace they were feeling right now would have been impossible without Gran's intervention. Mira remained standing by the tree, lost in thought, while her friend stood nearby. She eavesdropped on her friend's conversation. Alice asked what Lily had heard from Gran. Mira sincerely wanted her friend to get answers to her questions. However, alongside her concern for her friend, a slight pang of envy crept into Myra's heart. She honestly admitted to herself that if she had been chosen to accompany Gran instead of Lily, she would have been happy. She even felt a little envious that it wasn't her standing next to Gran at this decisive moment. The girl lowered her gaze, tormented by doubts. She didn't understand why they had called on her, of all people, someone so ordinary, for this dangerous task. It seemed to her that her presence here might be superfluous, and she felt she wasn't important enough for such a mission. At that moment, a calm voice interrupted her thoughts, answering her unspoken questions directly. Gran stood nearby, leaning against a tree trunk with his arms crossed over his chest. He looked unflappable, as if he had been observing her inner turmoil the whole time. The young man explained that the reason for her presence here was quite simple. He needed to correct her misconception. These words sounded confident and direct, making her realize that her invitation had not been a coincidence. Mira flinched in surprise. She hadn't noticed him approaching, and her mind refused to believe that he had heard her doubts. The girl uttered his name in confusion, stumbling over her words in astonishment. The young man apologized for appearing so suddenly, but immediately steered the conversation toward an unexpected topic, noting that she seemed to dislike men. Mira blushed and began to make excuses, gesturing animatedly. She assured him that wasn't the case at all. She had simply started unconsciously comparing all men to her father. Hearing this explanation, Gran visibly flustered. A bead of sweat rolled down his face as he realized something important. He surmised that it must have been difficult for her with him as well, since the issue concerned relationships with men. This remark made Mira worry about the young man's state of mind. She asked, looking confused, if he was all right. After all, his behavior seemed strange and unbalanced to her. Inside, the girl was analyzing the situation. She looked at Gran and wondered who he was to her. Alice? He was the very familiar to whom Lily had opened her soul. However, Gran suddenly changed the subject, as if his previous confusion had vanished without a trace. His gaze became serious and focused as he turned to her. He asked a question that had absolutely nothing to do with the current conversation about relationships. The young man inquired why the shaman class was considered so weak. Mira was stunned by such a sharp turn in the conversation. She could only ask in confusion, not understanding where he was going with this or why he was suddenly interested in this topic right now. Mira began to explain why shamans are considered weak. She noted that although they can summon spirits for attack and support, this doesn't make them strong fighters, because shamans' abilities are similar to mages' spells. Mira added that attacks using spirits often fail, which significantly reduces their effectiveness. That is precisely why shamans have earned a reputation as the worst branch of mages. Gran decided to clarify the details and asked if there were really very few shamans. Mira confirmed his guess, noting that there were indeed very few of them. Gran listened to her story and thoughtfully stroked his chin. The information he'd received came together in his mind into a single picture. However, he then decided to add some important historical context. Gran explained that just a few hundred years ago, shamans were the object of universal admiration. Mira was stunned by what she heard and asked if shamans had really once been the object of universal admiration. Lily agreed that, given the current situation, it was hard to believe, but then remembered that Gran wasn't from this time. Off to the side, Alice and Lily were discussing Gran. Alice remarked that although he looked young, he was actually a terrible old man. Gran turned to Mira, asking if she knew that spirits also had ranks. The girl admitted she didn't know that and apologized for her lack of knowledge. The young man reassured her, telling her not to worry, since other shamans probably didn't know either. Mira was still skeptical, asking, "Can that really be true?" Then Gran began to explain. He said that spirits have two main ranks. The first are the lower spirits, the very ones people talk about in society. But there are also higher spirits. Gran explained that these are special spirits, of which there is only one for each element. Mira was stunned by this information, finding it hard to believe such beings existed. Gran added an important detail about the higher spirits to his explanation. He reminded her that, among other things, these spirits possess the power to cause actual cataclysms. This information only fueled Myra's curiosity. With hope and excitement in her voice, the girl asked if it was possible to make a contract with such powerful beings. The young man was a little flustered as he answered her question. A bead of sweat appeared on his face as he explained that the possibility of making a contract with a higher spirit depended largely on luck. But not only on that, Gran emphasized that the key factor was whether the spirit itself would like her. This condition turned out to be far more complicated than the simple submission to which other mages were accustomed. Then Gran decided to explain the fundamental difference between shamans and other classes. He mentally compared them to Lily and Alice, identifying them as a tamer and a necromancer, respectively. Unlike them, shamans do not subjugate spirits to their will. They do not use coercion or slavery contracts. Instead, they unleash the spirit's power by cooperating with them as equals. The young man sternly warned Mira that she must always remember one important truth. Spirits merely lend them their power. This is not slavery or ownership, and she must never forget it. Mira listened attentively to the instruction, realizing the depth of responsibility and the fundamental difference in approach that falls on the shoulders of a shaman. Gran continued his explanation, revealing the true reason for the difficulties in working with spirits. He noted that the main problem lies in the nature of the spirits, for they are very capricious beings. The young man explained that everything depends on their mood. If the spirits are favoring the shaman, they lend their power in full, filling him with might. However, if they're in a bad mood, they do not share their power at all, leaving the mage powerless. Mira listened intently to this information, trying to grasp the full depth of the connection. She asked if she had understood the essence correctly. The more the spirits liked her, the greater her compatibility with them, the more power they were willing to place at her disposal. For her, this was a revelation that changed her understanding of the mechanics of shamanic magic. Gran confirmed her conclusion, but added an important nuance regarding misconceptions. He pointed out that it was precisely because of this unpredictability that shamans often mistakenly believe they command the spirits, though in reality everything depends on the will of the beings themselves. Likely, the spirits feel the same way, sensing the instability of this power. Mira realized that this was exactly why frequent quarrels and misunderstandings arise between shamans and spirits. Mira grew sad, realizing the consequences of such dependence. She surmised that, ultimately, if a shaman fails to make a contract with the Great Spirit, the profession remains doomed to failure anyway. Gran asked her not to be mistaken. After all, even the lowest spirits, if they so desire, can easily overpower any mage, matching them in strength. Mira was stunned by this information. With anxiety and impatience, she asked, "How? Then, could one make a contract with a spirit?" At that moment, her mind was flooded with memories. She recalled the long hours Lily had spent in the library, surrounded by books. Her attempt to tame a monster. She remembered herself running alone through the forest, feeling useless. Mira admitted that up until that moment, as a shaman, she had been completely powerless. However, despite the weight of past failures, hope resonated in her voice. Mira could no longer hold back the emotions that had built up after the conversation about the weakness of shamans. Her eyes shone with a mixture of determination and despair. She declared loudly and sincerely that this was precisely why she wanted to summon a spirit. She desperately wanted to be useful to those around her and not feel like a burden. Turning to Gran, she poured all her pleading into a single sentence. If he knew a way to help her gain strength, she begged him to teach her. It was the cry of a girl's soul, one who was tired of her own helplessness. Watching Gran's reaction, she wondered to herself if her words were appropriate. Mira noticed his confusion and the lack of an immediate response. Her confidence wavered, and anxiety showed on her face. She called his name quietly and uncertainly, fearing that her request had been a mistake or that she had offended him in some way with her insistent plea. Seeing her state, Gran didn't keep her waiting. He smiled slightly, though a bead of sweat on his face betrayed his slight discomfort with the situation. He confirmed that the quickest way to actually secure the contract did indeed exist. Her first question was about safety. She asked if it was dangerous. She showed that she was willing to take a risk for the sake of power. Gran hurried to reassure her, stating that there was no particular danger in it. The young man's expression became extremely serious and focused. His eyes conveyed complete determination. He quietly but firmly commanded Estina to appear. Thick, dark tentacles began to rise from the ground around him, writhing and enveloping the space in a gloomy substance. Within this gloomy vortex, Estina's spirit manifested. Her long hair flowed upward, obeying the magical currents, and curved horns were clearly visible on her head. Chains wrapped around her body, their links glinting in the dim light. Mira watched this spectacle up close. The girl thought to herself that a person had literally crawled out of Gran's shadow. The dark substance from which the woman had emerged dissipated, and she rushed forward. Estina embraced the young man tightly, pressing her whole body against him. Her face beamed with happiness. She exclaimed joyfully, addressing him as her master. Clinging to Gran, she was incredibly happy to see him after such a long separation. Gran clearly didn't like this. He asked her to stop. Estina was indignant and said that she had been eagerly waiting all this time for him to call her. But her master hadn't called her at all. Gran sheepishly agreed that it was wrong of him. However, in his mind, he admitted that he had simply been sleeping all this time. The young man steered the conversation toward business. He explained that he had called her today because there was something he wanted to ask of her. Hearing this, Estina's face lit up with joy. She asked again, "Do you really want to ask me for something?" Gran, however, merely thought gloomily that he didn't actually want to. Gran, keeping Estina close to him, smiled and explained his request to her. He needed her to bring a spirit for the girl. Estina asked in surprise, not fully understanding her master's intentions. Her face showed a hint of confusion. Inside, the girl grew anxious. She wondered if her master was planning to make a contract with a spirit other than her. Gran dispelled her thoughts. Gran turned and pointed in a certain direction. He informed her that the girl over there would be the one to sign the contract with the spirit. Estina looked in the indicated direction in surprise, not noticing the stranger's presence. She wondered to herself, who on earth is that? And since when has Mira been standing here? Gran reproached Estina for not noticing Mira, who had been standing there all along. Gran introduced Mira, calling her an acquaintance. Mira stood with her arms crossed over her chest, a look of bewilderment on her face. Gran added that although Mira was a shaman, she had never once made a contract with a spirit. Having said this, Gran covered his face with his hand. The young man explained that this was precisely why he thought it would be best to ask her for help regarding spirits. Estina reacted instantly to his words. She darted forward. The girl exclaimed joyfully that she would go right now and bring the spirit. Mira stood, gazing into the distance at the horizon, where trees and the sky were visible. Gran quietly remarked with relief that Estina had finally left. He stood nearby, his hands behind his back, and calmly remarked that at least they would manage somehow with the spirits now. The young man turned to his companion and added that whether the spirit liked her or not depended entirely on her. He asked if she understood that. Mira placed her hand on her chest, her eyes wide. She declared that she would try. Then Gran added that there was something else. He explained the nature of spirits. Gran said that spirits themselves use the caster's magical power to cast their spells. In other words, the more magic she had, the more the spirit would be able to manifest its true power. Mira asked if that meant she needed to train to increase her magical power. Grant confirmed that was exactly the case. The young man added that he would explain exactly how to do this later. He promised to explain it to all three of them at once, so he advised the girl not to worry. Mira agreed. Then the conversation turned to an unexpected topic. Mira hesitated and asked who Estina actually was. The girl admitted that she had never heard of spirits before and had never seen them in human form. A faint smile lit up Grant's face. He revealed the secret, explaining that Estina was a high spirit who ruled over darkness. This news shook the girl to her very core. Night fell upon the ancient building, whose walls were thickly entwined with ivy. Inside, three people in dark hoods gathered around a long table. The one sitting at the head of the table informed the assembled group that a week had passed since they had mastered the power of the Red Dragon, and now they needed to consider how to use that power going forward. Folding his fingers together, he asked, "What is the Demon Lord doing right now?" One of the standing companions answered the question. He reported that no dangerous movements had been detected at the moment. The other necromancers added that, moreover, it seemed the Demon Lord was participating in the training of his master and her friends. One of them laughed, noting how gracious the Demon Lord was. Suddenly, the calm of the meeting was shattered by a powerful explosion. The loud sound of the collision echoed through the room, causing those inside to flinch. One of those gathered abruptly raised his hand in a defensive gesture. His voice rang out loud and alarmed as he shouted about an attack. The reaction was immediate. None of the necromancers panicked, and one even said that this was happening again. Another necromancer suggested that it was all the fault of the nature of necromancers, which allows them to attract enemies out of nowhere. One of the necromancers suggested not worrying about the numbers. He declared that they could simply kill them all and be done with it. The leader tensed. Listening to the continuing sounds of blows, he noted that there were many enemies based on the sounds and wondered exactly how many had attacked them. A powerful explosion rocked the room, sending clouds of dust and debris flying. Several people in dark robes lay on the floor around the epicenter of the blast. Through the smoke and debris, the distinct silhouette of a lone figure stood motionless. A voice cut through the chaos, stating that the attacker was, in fact, just one. The necromancers were stunned by what they heard. One of those standing declared that breaking into the enemy's lair alone was madness. Another voice doubted the reality of what was happening, asking if this was some kind of joke. Gran entered the room and jumped onto the table. The young man looked around and asked if this was really the boss's room. The necromancers were taken aback. One of the necromancers present demanded that Gran answer the question of who he was. Gran looked unperturbed. He introduced himself by name, then declared that he was the Lord of Demons, risen from the grave they had so carefully guarded. These words threw one of the assembled necromancers into confusion. His patterned mask hid his face, but his posture betrayed his shock. A skeleton rose behind him. His voice broke into a scream as he demanded, "Is this truly the Lord of Demons standing before us?" Gran strode confidently across the table toward the necromancer leader, decapitating everyone in his path. The necromancer leader begged Gran to stop. Gran looked down at them. His gaze was focused. He addressed them, noting that no one was waiting for them on the battlefield. The necromancer leader spread his arms wide, summoning his power. A huge red dragon emerged from the darkness, its jaws bared, full of sharp teeth. The necromancer declared that since Gran was so insistent, he would show him his power. Gran asked if he had really made the dragon his familiar after all. He honestly admitted that he had thought his opponent wouldn't succeed, but was surprised by his abilities. The necromancer threatened the young man. Gran made a slight movement with his hand. His fingers formed a specific position, and a thin line of blue energy ran between them. That simple gesture was enough. The red dragon's massive head crashed to the floor. The sound of the impact echoed throughout the room. The necromancer's leader froze in shock. Only a bewildered sound of confusion escaped his throat. Gran looked at the defeated monster and his bowed opponent. He calmly noted that it was better not to say anything that would spoil the mood. He asked why his opponent had decided he could win by using the red dragon's undead, which Gran had already defeated before. The leader of the necromancers knelt, feeling defeated. Inside, he berated himself for the mistake he had made. He admitted to himself that he had been careless. In his entire career as a necromancer, this was the first time he had gained control of such a powerful undead creature, and he had simply lost his head with excitement, which had led to this outcome. Gran looked at his bowed opponent. His face was serious, his gaze piercing. The young man asked a question that reflected his frustration at being underestimated by his enemies. He asked if they considered him a complete nobody. Gran stood on the table, towering over the necromancer leader. He asked his opponent if he didn't see the obvious. The young man noted that, apart from the leader, no one else in the room was breathing. The aftermath of his attack lay scattered on the floor around them. Severed necromancer heads were strewn everywhere. The necromancer leader looked extremely frightened. Gran strode confidently toward him, his boots thudding against the floor. The necromancer fell to his knees, begging for his life. He assured him that he was ready to answer any questions and would hide nothing, just to stay alive. Gran stopped and said that since the necromancer had spoken up, he wanted to ask him something. The necromancer hastily agreed to answer any question. The young man asked if his interlocutor knew that the undead did not arise on their own. The necromancer leader asked in confusion what he meant. Gran remarked that if he didn't know, then so be it. Although he didn't understand the meaning of the question, the necromancer was satisfied, since the matter was settled and his life was spared. Suddenly, the space around the necromancer was filled with a dark, grainy texture that seemed to obscure his vision. The necromancer's voice sounded confused and was full of fear. He asked what was happening, and why couldn't he see anything? In desperation, he reminded him of the promise of mercy. In response, Gran's calm and cold voice rang out. The young man realized that he hadn't promised anything of the sort, not even a single word. The necromancer threw his head back and spread his arms wide, as if trying to grasp at the air. A short scream of terror escaped his throat. He began to fall backward. His voice trembled with fear. He desperately cried out for help. Gran declared that he could call whoever he wanted, since there was only one material for creating undead in this room. The young man added that there was plenty of it here, as if justifying his actions with practical necessity. The necromancer fell to his knees, his voice sounding like a plea. He asked in bewilderment why Gran was attacking them. Sincere confusion shone through his words. He reminded them that Gran himself had been resurrected by a necromancer. Gran began his reply with a pause, as if weighing his words. Gran continued his reasoning, using a metaphor about sparks. He noted that anyone would want to brush off the sparks flying at them. The young man added that those with even a spark of courage were nothing but trouble. The necromancer tried to explain his motives. He apologized for the task entrusted to Alice, which involved killing the red dragon. The man admitted that he was simply desperately trying to raise the status of necromancers. However, the leader of the necromancers could not come to terms with what had happened. His face was contorted with horror. He screamed that such cruelty was unforgivable. Gran calmly held a candlestick with 3 burning candles in his hand. Granes mirqued sardanically. Then the young man began his reply, noting that, to be perfectly honest, he possessed neither mercy nor guilt. Because of this, the necromancer shouldn't even bother asking for forgiveness, try to use his opponent's pity to save his own life. With a sinister expression on his face, Gran said that his lack of such qualities was due to the fact that he was the Lord of Demons. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.